Now we come to the week that quite literally changed the world. The 7 days from Palm Sunday through Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and on to that first Easter have adjusted all of our lives. Jesus didn't make a move during Holy Week that hasn't been doubted or denied by critics somewhere, and the more sensationalist and radical revisionist critics have been the most vocal in suggesting that none of this is historical, that nothing of this really took place as the Gospels have it. Well, fortunately, all four Gospels are very carefully tuned in to what Jesus did during those 7 days. And so every move that Jesus makes during that week has been denied and yet supported by the evidence, as we shall see. Now, for openers, we have that problem that I hope to solve, and that is the Palm Sunday crowd singing Hosanna on Sunday and screaming Crucify on Friday. How could they change their minds? Well, the usual answer is, well, Jesus lost support from one group after another. On Monday, for example, he decommercializes the temple. And that, of course, is going to antagonize the bankers, the dove dealers, those who control the sacrificial animals. They don't like their trade ruined for a day, so Jesus lost the commercial element. And then he loses support of another group and another group, until finally, by Good Friday, there's nobody left to support him, and that's why they're disillusioned, and they yell, "Crucify, crucify." I think that is the wrong answer, and as I hinted last time, I think that instead of losing popularity during Holy Week, Jesus is gaining it on a day-by-day basis. Now, I well realize this does nothing to solve the problem. Fact is, it makes it a little worse. But first, let me try to defend that thesis that Jesus was actually gaining in popularity. Let's do a rundown on those days. Now, obviously on Sunday, he remains very, very popular, except for the priests. They're opposing him, of course, continually. In fact, they criticized all this adulation, and Jesus has to shut them up with a beautiful line. He says, if these people didn't cry out, the stones would cry out, which might almost be applied to archaeology because the stones continue to cry out today. But notice when he decommercializes the temple on Monday, overthrowing the table of the money changers and so on. Sure, he loses the commercial element, but in any transaction, wherever you've ever shopped, are there more buyers or sellers? There are always more buyers, especially all the Passover pilgrims that have been flooding into Jerusalem for the Passover week, augmenting its population by a factor of 4 or 5 times. Jerusalem is usually a town of only about 50,000 people. But at the high festivals, the Passover, Tabernacles, Pentecost, and so on, 200,000 or 250,000. Now all these pilgrims are flooding the temple markets, trying to buy Passover sacrifices, trying to exchange their money, because the rules were if you came there with filthy Roman sesterces or terrible Greek denarii, they had to be cleansed by exchange so that you could pay the sacred half-shekel temple dues at a nice discount to the bankers, of course, and a nice kickback to Annas, Caiaphas, and company. Josephus tells us that those who ran the temple and all the concessionaires had to pay a kickback to Annas, Caiaphas, and company. Annas, by the way, you might call the godfather of Jerusalem. He was the gray eminence behind the throne. He was the one who pulled all the strings. And this is why the Gospel of John and others point out that Jesus' first hearing was before Annas, the fellow who ran the politics in Jerusalem. And so the critics wail that the Gospels call Annas high priest in addition to Caiaphas. Well, for goodness sake, that's only an honorific title. Why make a fuss about that? Josephus also tells us, by the way, that Annas and Caiaphas, of course, they're not popular among Christians. They're not popular among Jews either. The Talmud says, "Woe to the house of Annas, woe to their serpent-like hissing." And as far as that family is concerned, they had the world's record for nepotism. Josephus tells us that Annas made high priest. 5 of his sons also made the high priesthood. And the present incumbent, Joseph Caiaphas, was his son-in-law. He married the boss's daughter. That's number 6. That was the way to get ahead in those days. And what's changed? And they controlled, as I say, all the concessions, and they got the kickbacks. If you brought a lamb down from Galilee, the priest might have been prone to find a blemish in it. Then you'd have to buy another lamb at inflated prices in the temple market. And so you almost might see the superhighway going into Jerusalem in those days with a big advertising sign by the side of the road. Annas, Caiaphas, and company, quote, everything for your Passover sacrifice. And the pilgrims didn't like that. And so Jesus then, at least for one day, clears out the temple because they've made it a den of thieves. So as of Monday night, Jesus is more popular than ever before. Now the priests are panicked. How are they going to discredit Jesus? Well, they will use the time-honored method of trying to embarrass him publicly by driving a wedge then between Jesus and his followers. They can show that if Jesus answers their probing questions incorrectly, the people will see that their idol has clay feet and they'll suddenly disgrace him. Now, if you're prone to doubt that this ever took place, I would simply ask you to look around at politics today and how often the world's press corps will come to a familiar candidate for any public office, especially the presidency or the prime ministership or whatever, and they will toss all kinds of probing questions at these candidates to try to get them to misspeak themselves. Then they've got a big story in their hands. And does it ever work? It works magnificently. 2 little examples from my home state of Michigan. There was a presidential Republican candidate named George Romney, who formerly ran American Motors Corporation. He went to the primary in New Hampshire, and he dropped one word that ended his candidacy. The word was brainwashing. It was during the Vietnam War, and they ran with that word. Soon the whole world thought that George Romney was soft in the brain, having been brainwashed, and that was all for his candidacy. Perhaps you might also remember another Michigan product named Gerald Ford. In his debates with Jimmy Carter, for example, I'm sure that Ford wishes that he had not said that the people of Poland have a wonderful amount of freedom. Sorry, folks, back in those days, as before Lech Wałęsa and the whole Solidarity movement, Ford lost the entire Slavic vote and the election for the presidency in the U.S. because he answered the wrong way. So please don't ever doubt the credibility of what happened on Tuesday and Wednesday of Holy Week. This was a clever means by which Jesus' opponents would try to disgrace him, but there's a difference here. Jesus turned out to be a little brighter than some of our politicians. And although they asked him these wild teasers like, is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar or not, and so on, and Jesus answered that one perfectly. He was able to show indeed that each one deserves his particular claim on you. Jesus answers all the questions perfectly, and so the result is, as of Wednesday night, he is even more popular than ever before. Which means then he's got only 24 hours to blow it, as it were, Thursday. Suddenly now, on Thursday, he must have lost complete support from the populace. It won't work. Thursday is a very quiet day. Jesus doesn't go downtown that day. Instead, he stays with Mary and Martha and Lazarus at their home in Bethany, and they have a very quiet last afternoon. That evening, in an upper room, they have a very, very private dinner party to which only the 12 were invited. And that evening, at around 10 o'clock in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is arrested, and the next morning they're screaming, "Crucify." The problem is a big one. How do we solve it? Well, there's a wrong answer to it and a right answer, okay? Here's the wrong answer. And here's the one we are hearing more and more in some of the revisionist circles of sensationalist scholarship today. Here's how it goes. You're right, Maier. You're right. There's no way the crowd could ever have turned against Jesus. Had no reason to. And therefore, all four Gospels that claim that there were any Jews on Good Friday yelling "Crucify" show that they're anti-Semitic. This never happened. There never was such a prosecution. The Gospels ought to be re-edited, especially the Gospel of John. And the reason that they did this is because of the struggle of church and synagogue when they're trying to develop Christianity in the imperial city of Rome. Just for a moment, let me play devil's advocate and try to support that. And for, there's something to be said. Let's say, for example, you want to found a new church in Rome, and so you go out canvassing, go door to door, knock on the door. Gaius comes to the door with his toga, and you say, "Hello, friend. We would like you to join the new Christian church in the catacombs at the edge of town." And he says, "What does Christian mean?" Well, let me tell you. Christian is named for Jesus Christ, who was crucified as a common criminal by one of your Roman governors. Is a person going to get to first base with that message? And so I can just see all these canvassers coming back to the local clergyman and saying, "Well, we didn't get very far." And he then supposedly said, "Well, I understand that." I'll tell you what. Why don't you picture that Roman governor as being pressured into it by the Jews? We don't like the Jews anyway, so why don't you blame it on the Jews? And supposedly then, this is why the Gospels have shifted the responsibility for the prosecution on Good Friday from Pontius Pilate, whom the Gospels now whitewash, and shifted instead to the Jews. Now, this is the wrong answer. It's a deadly wrong answer because it absolutely undermines the reliability of all of the Gospels. And quite frankly, if this were true, then I could no longer regard the Gospels as a reliable historical source, because that is not the way it comes out in the New Testament. You recall how it comes out in the New Testament. Pilate's trying to defend Jesus, trying to let him off the hook. And there certainly was an element from the Jewish populace yelling "Crucify" on Good Friday. But that's the wrong answer. Let me now suggest the right answer, and I'll just bet quite a few of you might already know what that answer is. Who says it's the same crowd on Sunday and Friday? It wasn't the same crowd. On Palm Sunday, Jesus is being cheered on by those who had witnessed the miracle in Bethany, and his Galilean followers, and the Passover pilgrims, and the Judeans also who liked him. They had no reason to turn against Jesus. Well, why didn't they defend him then on Good Friday? They don't know about it. Why? Thursday night around 10 p.m., I said, is when Jesus is arrested. That's like 3 or 4 a.m. to us because they went to bed at sundown. That's why the disciples couldn't even stay awake in Gethsemane, you recall. So they don't know about this until the next morning, but they haven't been watching Jerusalem television the night before, prophet from Galilee arrested, film at 11. There's no Jerusalem Times morning edition on Good Friday giving the story. It's a rumor mill, Jerusalem is. By that time, Jesus has been brought to Pontius Pilate's tribunal at dawn on Good Friday when the day began, and they're not even able to crowd into Pilate's courtyard. Pilate was holding court in the palace of Herod at the western part of the old city of Jerusalem. And the courtyard there is going to hold 3,000 people, maybe only 2,000. So there's another group of people there. And lest you may think this is a strange interpretation, I say it doesn't violate one syllable of the biblical record. Because I want to point out the most overlooked verse in the entire Bible. Okay? I think it's the most overlooked verse, Old or New Testament. Luke 23:27. Luke 23:27. Jesus is on the way to Calvary dragging his cross. And Luke carefully tells us, a great multitude of Jewish men and women were weeping as he took that cross. There are the pro-Jesus elements in society. There's his constituency. There's the Passover pilgrims. There's the Hosanna people on Sunday. They've never turned against Jesus, never had any reason to. Don't know about it till it's too late. Try to explain to me, how could the church in the Middle Ages have gotten off on this wrong kick, blaming all Jews collectively, sometimes even saying all Jews then and now, which is terrible theology, and which isn't even true historically. How could the medieval churchmen have overlooked that passage? The weeping Jewish men and women of Jerusalem. How could they have overlooked the 120 core Christians at Pentecost, or the 3,000 converts, all of whom were Jewish? The membership of the earliest Christian church in Jerusalem, overwhelmingly Jewish. Anti-Semitism should never have ever gotten started in Christianity. And there never was any reason to, but because of this wrong interpretation, suddenly, well, for centuries, it went on. This feeling that Jews are Christ killers. And the poor Jewish people are feeling that to the present day yet. And that's why it's so very important to build bridges to these people who have been wounded in so many ways, forced to live in ghettos in the Middle Ages, who were the object of the terrible Holocaust in World War II and so on. That's got to stop. Never should have arisen in the first place. Not Christians who follow the advice of their master to love one another. But hold it, we still have to answer the question, well then who's yelling crucify on Good Friday? Now I'll speak out of the other side of my mouth and say, well, there certainly was a portion, probably only a fraction, of the Jewish society at that time that was yelling crucify. Do we know who these people were? We certainly do. Predictably, I guess, I call to witness Flavius Josephus. Josephus tells us that the biggest industry in the Holy Land was running the temple. He says that there were 10,000 in the temple police alone. So you don't have to worry about getting a crowd out to yell crucify in terms of Pilate's courtyard. You can just imagine what happened. Good Friday at dawn, Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest, sends out an email. Hey, we're going to hit the bricks today. Be out there 20 minutes from now, Pilate's courtyard. If you want your job, be there. That's why the whole group is orchestrated. Their jobs are at stake. The Sadducean group among the Jews didn't even believe in the resurrection, much less anything in Jesus' message. They were the Rome-serving lackeys that were simply trying to eliminate Jesus for political reasons in addition to economic reasons. And this is why the whole group is carefully controlled by the priesthood. Why, they sound like a speech choir. Remember when Pilate's dealing with them? Pilate says, well, whom shall I release to you, Jesus or Barabbas? You can just hear them asking, who shall we ask for? Who shall we ask for? Ask for Barabbas. Barabbas, Barabbas. Pilate goes on, then what shall I do with Jesus who is called the Christ? What do we say? Let him be crucified. Let him be crucified. They all shout in unison. That's called a hired claque. That's called a controlled group. And please remember that famous Matthew passage where they say his blood be upon our heads and upon our children. That applies only to those who were shouting that message, not to all the Jewish people at that time. That's ridiculous ever to have talked about collective guilt of the Jewish nation because of Good Friday. Terrible theology. You want to talk about collective guilt for Good Friday? Just look at yourself and everybody else. Collective guilt of humanity is what caused the necessity of God's ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ.